People often say civilization was built on grain. Wheat, rice, corn. Fields you can fence. Harvests you can count. Food that can be owned. But along the edges of the world, where land dissolves into salt and tide, entire communities survived on something that refused those rules. It grew without permission, without farming, without fences. It arrived with the tide and left with it. For centuries, it fed villages, sailors, migrants, and the quietly desperate. Then, almost without notice, it vanished from the modern table. Not because it failed, because it worked too well outside the system. Because it could not be owned. A place where the quiet knowledge of landscapes is kept, not for nostalgia, but for memory. Some things disappear loudly. Wars, cities, empires. Others fade in silence. Plants, foods, practices that once carried entire populations through winter and famine. If preserving these forgotten systems matters to you, you may remain here with us and follow the archive as it opens. Tonight, we pull something from the coastal margins of history. A food that fed generations. A food the modern world quietly stepped around. We begin where land gives up control, at the edge of the sea. Along the cold shores of the North Atlantic, long before supermarkets and shipping lanes, the tides left behind thick forests that never touched soil. Dark ribbons tangled across stone. Long, glistening fronds breathing with the ocean. Kelp. To modern eyes, it looks like debris, something storms throw ashore. But to coastal cultures, it was as dependable as sunrise. In the northern islands of Scotland, crofters walked the beaches at low tide with woven baskets, not scavenging, harvesting. The sea had planted fields of its own. Further north, the people of Iceland cut great sheets of it from tidal rocks, drying them on volcanic stone where wind never stopped moving. Across the world, in Japan, entire culinary traditions formed around it. Kombu, wakome, nori. But in older stories, it had different names. Names that translated roughly to the forest beneath the waves, or the rope of the sea. To many coastal societies, these plants were not gathered casually. They were seasonal knowledge. Families knew which coves renewed fastest, which tides revealed the strongest growth, which species thickened soups, and which strengthened the body. Children learned the textures before they learned numbers. The ocean garden was patient, and it returned every year. Stand in a kelp forest beneath the water, and the silence becomes something physical. Columns rising from rock, blades stretching toward filtered sunlight, some reaching 30 meters long, drifting like cathedral banners, anchored by holdfasts that grip stone like living roots. But kelp is not a plant in the ordinary sense. It belongs to a group of brown algae that evolved separately from the forests on land. A different experiment in life, one that never needed soil, or rain, or seasons of planting. It grows where cold oceans surge with nutrients, where currents churn the deep. The edges of the Pacific Ocean and the North Atlantic became its endless farms, no farmer required. Some species can grow nearly half a meter in a single day. Imagine a crop that plants itself, feeds on the chemistry of the sea, repairs damage overnight, and returns even after storms tear entire forests loose. For communities living on thin coastal soil, this mattered. Land harvests could fail. Kelp rarely did. Dry it and it lasts months, sometimes years. Boil it into broths that restore salt and minerals lost from hard labor. Grind it into meal when grain stores collapse. Feed it to animals when winter refuses to leave. Even the ashes returned iodine to poor farmland. Nothing about it demanded ownership, which is exactly what made it powerful, and eventually inconvenient. The written record notices kelp mostly when people are starving. History often works that way. It ignores quiet abundance, but during crisis, forgotten foods become visible again. In 17th century coastal Europe, ship logs recorded barrels of dried seaweed taken aboard for long crossings, not as delicacy, as insurance. Sailors chewed it slowly to prevent sickness that came from months without fresh food. In island communities, winters could close the sea with ice and wind for weeks. During those months, the tide line became a pantry. Then came a moment history remembers more clearly, the catastrophe now called the Great Irish Famine. Potatoes failed, fields rotted, systems built on a single crop collapsed with brutal efficiency. Along the western coasts, families who had long gathered seaweed returned to it fully. They boiled carrageen moss into thick broths, mixed kelp into what little grain remained. Some accounts describe entire villages surviving weeks on sea vegetables alone while waiting for relief ships that did not arrive. It was not a comfortable food, but it was there, and sometimes that is the only requirement for survival. Across the Atlantic, indigenous coastal peoples of North America had understood this long before European ships appeared. Kelp was eaten fresh, roasted in fires, or dried for travel. Long ocean journeys carried bundles of it like rations, because the sea does not forget to grow. Empires rose, trade routes expanded, but the tide still returned with food. For a time, humanity accepted this quiet partnership. Then, industry arrived, and the relationship changed.